Hi, Charles.
Hello.
How are you?
All right.
We are live on YouTube.
Okay. So should we wait a couple minutes?
Yeah, why don't you wait a few more? They're sort of.
Okay.
Everybody, just make sure you mute yourselves
I
when the
can't.
rabbi starts, and then
I
we'll.
can't hear anything. No, I can't hear anything.
I can't hear anything.
We can hear you, Irene.
We can hear you.
Can't hear anything.
That happens
Your
sometimes.
microphone.
I can't get any. Oh, I know why. I know why.
Turn your volume up.
There we go. I just turned my speakers on.
There we go.
All right, let's everybody just mute yourselves. You can keep your screen up if you want, but and then when the rabbi's done, we'll open it up at that point. So in case phones ring or dogs bark or whatever, we won't be interrupted that way. Thank you. You can start now.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's great to have you with us this evening for our adult education. We're going to be talking about Jewish Gangsters, a little known chapter in American Jewish history. There's kind of a misunderstanding about Jewish gangsters, which I'll start with, and that is that most people think of Jewish gangsters predominantly from the 1920s to the 1930s, and that's because the best known of the Jewish gangsters operated during that time. People like Bugsy Siegel and Lepke, Burkholder, Longi, Zwilman, Moe Meyer Lansky. But actually, we're going to be talking tonight about people who operated from the last quarter of the 19th century into the early 20th century. It's kind of a little known chapter of American Jewish history. Some of the people that were involved as Jewish gangsters had very brief gangster careers. They used organized crime as a way to get ahead financially, and then they kind of dropped out of the game or dropped out of the scene once they amassed what they considered to be a reasonably large amount of capital. Others, you're going to find out, were much more entrenched in the mob. They were swept up in the speakeasy movement during Prohibition. They continued to make money off of bootleg liquor, prostitution rings, gambling, racketeering, loan sharking. And you'll also hear tonight about a murder for hire business that was popularly known as Murder Incorporated. I just mentioned probably the best known of the Jewish gangsters, and even though these individuals wielded incredible power in America's very large cities for numerous years, Meyer Lansky once said that he and his colleagues were bigger than US Steel. But their numbers thinned considerably as World War II came to an end. Numerous among them were hunted down by authorities. They were jailed or executed. And actually, there were some that were never, ever caught. I will say at the outset of our discussion tonight that none of these individuals considered themselves to be religiously observant. Many of them actually publicly or privately scorned many of the core values of Judaism. But having said that, there were in a few critical moments of their lifetime, time that they lent their power to Jewish causes in America, to Nazi Europe, and to Israel, which was then called Palestine. Far from being heroes, Jewish mobsters have come to be seen as something of, you might think of to be called a novelty in Jewish history. And though their corrupt legacy actually continues today in Israel, which still struggles with Jewish-run organized crime even today. So let's talk about some of them, shall we? There were really a couple of major periods where organized Jewish criminal activity took place in America. The first period was at the end of the 19th century. Jews in New York and in Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Detroit, we'll talk specifically about Detroit a little bit later. They controlled more than 90% of all prostitution here in the United States. I don't know whether you're familiar with a woman whose name was Frederica Marm. She was called Marm Mandelbaum. She was a German Jewish immigrant. She became probably the most influential crime figure in New York City during what was termed the Gilded Age, accumulating more money and power than probably any woman of her era. She was the country's premier fence. In other words, she was a seller of stolen property. She became the head of one of the first organized crime rings and was the driving force behind New York City's festering underworld for about a quarter of a century. By 1880, Marm Mandelbaum had become the premier receiver of stolen merchandise in the country and one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, amassing a personal fortune estimated at well over $1 million. Now remember, we're talking about 1880. So $1 million in 1880, or more than $1 million in 1880, was certainly nothing to be scoffed at. She owned tenements in New York City, as well as warehouses in Brooklyn and New Jersey. And it was in these warehouses that she stored all of the stolen merchandise that she openly bought and sold. There was a July 1884 New York Times article that called her the nucleus and the center of the whole organization of crime in New York City. She was arrested. After she was arrested, she got out of prison on bail. She jumped bail. She went to Canada with well over $1 million in cash and diamonds. She settled in Hamilton, Ontario, which had no extradition agreement with the United States at the time. So New York City's most powerful criminal was able to live out the rest of her life in Canada pretty comfortably. This period of crime, however, left few names that we can actually remember. It was the period between the world wars, the era of Prohibition and the Great Depression, that saw the rise of the American Jewish gangster sort of as a force in this country. In 1919, the United States government attempted to regulate morality by outlawing the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages. Prohibition offered enormous opportunity for the mobster to provide what society still wanted, namely liquor. And another contributing factor to the rise of Jewish gangsterism was the morality of the age. At all levels of society, this was a time when pretty much anything went, anything was able to go. When an honest man might have been considered a sucker, and when flaunting the rules was more the norm than the abnorm. It's been said that if one were to compute the number of Americans who violated the 18th Amendment, whether as producers, conveyors, or peddlers of intoxicants, or as protectors of the trade, or as consumers, the total would probably be an overwhelming majority of the population. But it was in this milieu that the Jewish gangster actually rose to prominence. Contrary to modern Jewish criminals who are involved mostly in white-collar crime, things like fraud, things like insider trading, Ponzi schemes, or embezzlement, these individuals, they engaged in extortion and gambling and narcotics peddling and bootlegging and murder. And for a time, it was these individuals that dominated the rackets in Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Newark, Philadelphia, and New York. You might think of a composite picture or a composite portrait of, say, the typical Jewish gangster of this period. And if you were to look closely at that, it would show this individual to be a second generation male, usually of Eastern European parentage. That individual would generally be city bred. That individual would probably be in his early 20s. His parents would probably be working class and traditional, not orthodox, but traditional. That is, they would observe a number of Jewish traditions. They would observe a number of Jewish holidays, but they wouldn't comply necessarily with all of the religious injunctions that an Orthodox Jew or a Haredi Jew is required to perform. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of who we're looking at. This typical Jewish gangster would probably not have finished high school, would remain pretty strongly attached to his family throughout his life. Generally speaking, he was the only person in his immediate family to turn to a life of crime. You would find his brothers and his sisters following much more respectable routes to economic advancement and social mobility within the community. And moreover, the most famous group of Jewish gangsters didn't do so out of necessity, unlike the Jewish criminals of the late 19th century that we spoke about. They did not grow up or live in abject poverty. The typical Jewish gangster of the 20s and 30s chose crime. Let me repeat that. He chose crime because it was the quickest way for him to achieve material success, power, recognition, and status. It wasn't just for the money. It was for everything else that came with it as well. It was a means to become a somebody and move up and out of the middle class ghetto. Legitimate work was hard, it was dull, and it offered only slow charged ideas and economic and social mobility. Crime, on the other hand, was exciting. It provided a challenge for men of ability, for men who had an innate aggressiveness about them, for men that had a daring about them. It was that ever-present element of danger, being caught by the police or being killed by rivals, that added to the excitement of being a gangster. Jewish gangsters saw what they were doing in the same way that many of their non-Jewish colleagues saw themselves. They were providing a service. People wanted liquor, they wanted narcotics, they wanted gambling, they wanted women, and gangsters furnished them. Physical violence was accepted as a tool of the trade. It was a way to eliminate competition and protect one's interests. The American Jewish community at large entertained what you might call ambivalent feelings about the Jewish gangster. The Jewish leaders were, of course, repelled by him because he epitomized what you might think of as the bad Jew, the evil man who provided ammunition for the anti-Semite. They feared that publicized criminal activity by Jews would bring onus and hatred to the entire community. In the 1920s and the 1930s, these were not simple or mere idle concerns. The American atmosphere was charged with the anti-Semitic fulminations and activities of people like Henry Ford, the Ku Klux Klan, Gerald L.K. Smith, Father Charles Coughlin, and the German-American Bund. In addition, Jewish parents were in a perpetual state of anxiety lest their children be attracted to the lifestyle of the gangster and emulate him. But nevertheless, many people in the community harbored what you might think of as I guess the best word would be a grudging admiration for the Jewish mobster, because he competed physically with the non-Jew and gave as good as he got. The Jewish gangster had, quote, made it in America by beating the violent and physical Gentile at his own game. And at a time when Jews in Europe were at the mercy of hostile governments and under constant threat of violence and pogroms, the Jewish gangster provided American Jews oftentimes with a secret, vicarious satisfaction, and maybe even possibly what you might think of as pride. A number of Jewish gangsters acquired respect because they assumed the role of protector and defender of their people. In Chicago, the funeral of the Jewish gangster Samuel Nails Morton was attended by 5,000 Jews who felt that they owed him thanks for protecting their neighborhood from Jew baiters. Jewish mobsters in Detroit protected Jewish peddlers and grocery store owners from having to pay protection money to Polish and Italian hoodlums. And in the 1930s, New York Jewish thugs broke up German-American Bund rallies in New York and New Jersey. We'll hear a little bit more about that a little later. But despite their aversion to the gangster, even Jewish leaders were not above using the gangster's services on behalf of the community. Arnold Rothstein was asked to help end the New York Garment District strike in 1926, and Jewish gangsters were asked to help secure arms during Israel's War of Independence in 1948. We'll hear a little bit more about that later also. In spite of their own success in crime, most Jewish gangsters kept their families separate and unimplicated in their criminal pursuits and in their criminal enterprises. West Coast mobster Mickey Cohn summarized this attitude when he said, "We had a code of ethics like the ones among bankers, other people in other walks of life. That one never involved his wife or family in his work. These men wanted their children to marry well and achieve respectability and acceptance in the legitimate world. And they sent their children to the best schools and encouraged them to enter the professions like law or medicine. And in this, they were very much like other Jewish parents of their generation." Now, let me tell you about some of the prominent Jewish figures in organized crime prior to World War II. First, there was Moses Moe Annenberg, lived from 1878 to 1942. He was born in East Prussia, came to the United States in 1884. He was the circulation manager of all of the Hearst newspapers and magazines in America, when in the 1920s, he conceived the idea of establishing a telegraphic news service for bookie joints that would carry fast and accurate information from racetracks across the country. According to the IRS, which collected evidence of his tax evasion, Annenberg operated a racket that was a monopoly of the telegraph service from almost all of the racetracks in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Cuba. His wire service was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company's fifth largest customer. So extensive was this operation that one insider equated it with the British Empire. During the Great Depression, Annenberg's income from his racetrack wire service was conservatively estimated to be somewhere in the $6 million a year range. In 1939, while under investigation by the Justice Department, Annenberg divested himself of all of his interest in the racing wire service. He did not attempt to sell it to anyone or realize any salvage from it. He simply turned the key, locked the door, and walked away. But nevertheless, he was convicted of income tax evasion. He was fined $8 million and sentenced to 3 years in prison. And very shortly after he finished his prison term, he passed away. Arnold Rothstein lived from 1882 to 1928. He was the pioneer, what I like to call big businessman of crime here in the United States. Rothstein was born in New York City. He was the son of a respected middle-class Jewish merchant. The elder Rothstein was very well versed in religious and Hebrew classical literature. He was something of a well-known philanthropist. He was chairman of the board of New York's Beth Israel Hospital. Arnold never achieved that kind of respectability his family hoped he would, but he did exceed their expectations in another area. By the time he died, he amassed a fortune estimated to be in the millions of dollars. Rothstein understood the logic of coordination and the potential of organized crime. He's probably most remembered as the man allegedly responsible for, you've probably heard about this, the Black Sox scandal, the attempt to fix the 1919 Baseball World Series between the Chicago White Sox and the Cincinnati Reds. However, this was really pretty small potatoes for him. It was Rothstein who, during the 1920s, put together the largest gambling empire in the United States, and he controlled most of the gangs in New York, as well as that city's traffic in bootlegging, narcotics, and gambling. Rothstein attempted to bring what you might call order to the extreme competition that prevailed in the bootlegging business. He supplied money, he supplied manpower, he supplied protection. And if things went wrong, he was ready to provide bail and attorneys. Rothstein moved pretty freely in all circles, from politicians and statements to bankers and bums. On his payroll at one time or another were gangsters such as Waxy Gordon and Jack Legs Diamond, Lepke Burkholder, Albert Anastasia, and Frank Costello. Frank Costello later rose to be a boss of the mob and the star attraction of the Kefauver Crime Committee hearings, as well as a goodly number of public officials. So successful was Rothstein in organizing criminal enterprises and staying out of jail that Damon Runyon dubbed him the Brain. And his fame was such that he was immortalized during his lifetime by F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby as Meyer Wolfsheim. Despite this notoriety, Jewish community leaders in New York asked for and received his help in settling a strike in the garment district in 1926. Rothstein's life of crime, for actually, you might not believe this, for which he never spent one day in jail, ended when he was shot to death in New York's Park Central Hotel. True to his, what you might call, underworld creed, he refused to divulge the name of his assailant before he died. And the final irony about his life was that he received an Orthodox Jewish funeral after he was shot and killed. You might be familiar, or you probably have at least heard the name of Louis Lepke Burkholder. He lived from 1897 to 1944. He was nicknamed Lepke, Little Louis, by his mother. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called him the most dangerous criminal in the United States. He was born on the Lower East Side of New York. His family lived in a pretty crowded flat over a small hardware store that was owned by his father. Louis was the only one of 11 children to embark on a life of crime. One brother became a rabbi, another became a dentist, a third became a pharmacist, a fourth became a college professor. Little Louis actually got better than average grades in school and seemed to behave himself. But he quit school at the age of 15 after completing the 8th grade and went to work as a delivery boy. By the time Lepke was 18, his family, except Louis, had moved out west. He turned down an older brother's offer to put him through high school and college, and instead moved into a furnished room on the east side of New York. It was in this brawling neighborhood that Burkholder embarked on his criminal career. He joined a group of local hoods. They rolled drunks, they picked pockets, they robbed from pushcarts. His close associate at this time, and probably for the next 30 years, was Jacob Gura Shapiro, a surly, pretty coarse young man. Just after his 21st birthday, Lepke was sent to jail for stealing a salesman's sample case. Paroled in 1917, he was back in prison the next year on a larceny charge and was sent up again for 2 years in 1920. And upon his release, he turned his talent to labor racketeering. Lepke commanded an army of gangsters who extorted millions of dollars from his victims. Their weapons were destructive acids, bludgeons, blackjacks, knives, fire, ice picks, guns. For a fee, Lepke would protect manufacturers from strikers and unionization of their shops by intimidating workers and using strong-arm tactics. He also forced unions to do his bidding by installing his own business agents or by creating rival unions. Lepke explained that the trick was a captive union and a captive trade association. That way, you got both management and labor in your pocket. Lucky Luciano once commented that with the rest of us, it was booze, gambling, whores like that, but Lepke took the bread out of the workers' mouths. Lepke's system worked, and he became a legend. The few men who failed to heed the gang's orders or who dared to go to the police with their stories suffered destruction, acid throwing, mayhem, and even murder. And in the same way that he gained control over the unions through terror, Burkholder moved into legitimate businesses. Those who tried to fight him found their plants wrecked or their stocks ruined by a special Lepke task force. expert in the art of acid throwing. When a manufacturer surrendered, Lepke would place his men in the factory as managers, foremen, and bookkeepers. In his private life, Lepke was a devoted family man. He never drank nor gambled. Supposedly, it said he never raised his voice. By 1932, Buchholter dominated a wide assortment of industries in New York, including the bakery and the pastry drivers, the milliners, the garment workers, the shoe trade, the poultry market, the taxicab business, the motion picture operators, and the fur truckers. At the pinnacle of his power, he was the feudal lord of New York's underworld. His reputation through gangland was that he never lost his temper, but his own men feared him. They called him the Judge. Sometimes he was known as Judge Louis. One associate, Sholem Bernstein, summed it up for all when he said, "I don't ask questions, I just obey." It would be much healthier. I mentioned earlier Murder Incorporated, or the Syndicate and Murder Incorporated. In 1934, Buchholter helped organize the Syndicate. Its creation converted the scattered, unconnected mobs in New York, in Chicago, in Kansas City, and in other cities into a smooth-working, tightly bound business. On the early board of directors of his confederation of crime bosses were Lepke, Johnny Torino, Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Joe Adonis, Bugsy Siegel, and Abner Zwilman. They decided that this would be a loose working confederation, with each boss having his own territory and with the regional chiefs sitting together on a board of directors. It was this board that would dictate policy and handle all negotiations on the intermob level. It was Lepke who campaigned for a special enforcement group to keep the peace and ensure that the syndicate's decisions were carried out. Sometimes it was referred to Murder Incorporated. This crack core of killers was made up primarily of Jews from Brownsville, East New York, and Ocean Hill. They became the official execution squad for the syndicate. When Dutch Schultz boasted that he would do things his way, he was killed. And it was Charlie the Bug Workman and Mendy Weiss, two Murder Incorporated killers, who did the job on orders from Lepke. In 1941, Lepke was indicted for the killing of Joseph Rosen, a garment trucker, whom Lepke had driven out of business. Buchholter was the only top underworld figure of his time to be tried, convicted, and executed for murder. He died in Sing Sing prison on March 4th, 1944. But it's interesting that he was the only one that was ever convicted and executed. You've probably heard of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Was born in 1905, died in 1947. He was the archetypical movie mobster. He was handsome, he was hot-headed, he was ambitious, and he was ruthless. He was a petty thief and a muscleman who rose to become a crime lord. He played an important role in New York City's underworld activities during the 1920s and 1930s. He became a member of the East Coast Crime Syndicate's board of directors at the age of 28. Bugsy Siegel established the beachhead of organized crime in California and opened Las Vegas for the mob. He recognized the tremendous opportunities for profit from legalized casino gambling in Nevada, and with syndicate help, built the Flamingo Hotel. After it was built, however, he tried to keep most of the profits for himself. And it was this defiance of the syndicate that was to cost him his life. On a June evening in 1947, someone pointed a rifle at Siegel's face as he sat in the apartment of his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, and pumped 3 bullets into his head. Siegel thus had the distinction of being the first member of the syndicate's board of directors to be executed by his own. Then there was Abner Longi Zwilman, lived from 1904 to 1959. He was called the Al Capone of New Jersey. He was one of the biggest bootleggers of the Prohibition era. By the 1930s, he was the acknowledged leader of the New Jersey underworld and an associate of Dutch Schultz, of Lepke Burkhalter, Lucky Luciano, and Frank Costello. In 1934, Zwilman played an important role in the formation of the East Coast Crime Syndicate. He also sat on its board of directors. Following Dutch Schultz's murder in 1935, Zwilman was designated as public enemy number 1 of New Jersey. And despite his reputed criminal activities, Zwilman and his wife were respected by their neighbors and the Jewish community of Newark for all of their charitable work. Over 1,000 people attended his funeral, with the service being conducted by Dr. Rabbi Joachim Prince, the rabbi of Temple B'nai Abraham of Newark and president of the American Jewish Congress. You've heard me mention Dutch Schultz. His name actually was Arthur Flagenheimer. He was born in 1901, only lived to 1935. He grew up as a Jew in New York. His mother was a pious, patient woman whose great grief was that her son she adored turned out as he did. Arthur's playmates actually named him Dutch Schultz after an earlier 20th century hoodlum. He started out as a bootlegger. Flagenheimer moved into slot machines. He moved then into the Harlem numbers racket and the restaurant protection racket. And by 1932, he was clearing $2 million a year just from the restaurant racket alone. Dutch Schultz was killed in the men's room of a Newark chop house by Charlie the Bug Workman and Mendy Weiss when he defied the New York Syndicate, as I mentioned to you, decision not to kill Thomas Dewey, then investigating organized crime in Manhattan. Another one of the gangsters you probably might not have heard about is Abe Rellis. He was Abe Kid Twist Rellis. Lived from 1907 to 1941. Another New York-born hoodlum and killer about whom it was said he committed just about every act of violence against where there is a law. Rellis was one of Murder Incorporated's top gunmen, and it was his turning state's evidence in 1940 that provided the law with their first inside look at New York's crime syndicate. His testimony assisted in the conviction and execution of 7 major crime figures, Burkhalter being one of them. Rellis died in 1941 while he was under police guard. He fell or he was thrown from the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island. And probably one of the more famous of the Jewish gangsters that you probably have heard about was Meyer Lansky. Was born in 1902, lived to 1983. Frequently mentioned by law enforcement officials as being one of the kingpins of organized crime in the United States. Since the 1920s, he was linked with names like Annenberg and Siegel, Zwilman, Luciano, Torino, and Costello. His alleged gambling empire was at one time said to encompass Florida, the Caribbean islands, and Las Vegas. And although he had been indicted numerous times, Lansky was only convicted once in 1953 on a gambling charge. And at that time, he only served 3 months in jail. Lansky had no problem with establishing himself at first in Broward County. Lansky quickly acquired business interests and investments in Greater Miami, including casinos and nightclubs, racetracks. Among Lansky's horse and dog track investments was the Hollywood Kennel Club, a tropical park located in south of Miami near Coral Gables, Gulfstream Racetrack in Broward County. As he had done in New York, Meyer Lansky operated behind the scenes, only pulling the strings. Lansky worked with his old associate, Moe Annenberg, head of the nationwide wire service. All bookies had to go through the farm, his gambling operation in Hallandale, which allowed Lansky to take control of Miami area gamblers. By 1948, the Miami Herald newspaper estimated that the number of Lansky-owned gambling interests in Miami region totaled somewhere about 50. So you can see all of these individuals were very involved in a whole variety of endeavors, all of them leading to criminal activity. Vincent Allo wasn't a gambler by career or a manager by nature, and his money, although he had a lot of it, was out on the street. He would need a partner, and there was no question who that would be. Allo's old friend from back in New York City, Meyer Lansky. Allo knew Meyer wanted the same thing he did, a way out, respectability. Meyer had once said, don't worry. Look at history. Look at the Astors and the Vanderbilts, all those big society people. They were the worst thieves, and now look at them. It's just a matter of time. With Lansky in control, the casino exceeded expectations, and according to at least one gambling expert, the barn may have been the biggest money maker in the entire history of illegal gambling casinos, bringing in an estimated $10 million a year between 1947 and 1949. So I've told you about some of the individuals who were involved in organized crime as Jewish individuals. But I also wanted to mention, I talked a little bit before, that they came together and actually tried to do some positive things for the Jewish community. Emboldened by Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933, and then fueled by the Great Depression, anti-Semitism increased throughout the United States, and over 100 anti-Semitic organizations sprang up at that time across the country. You know the names. They had names like the Friends of the New Germany, also known as the Nazi Bund, the Silver Shirts, Defenders of the Christian Faith, the Christian Front, and the Knights of the White Camellia, among others, protected by the Constitution's First Amendment, they held public rallies, paraded through the streets in their uniforms, carrying Nazi flags. They published all kinds of scurrilous magazines and openly flaunted their hatred for Jews. American Jews were intimidated, and American Jews were frightened. Fearful of stirring up even more anti-Jewish sentiment, the American Jewish establishment's response was often, the best word I could use for it was tentative, maybe even cautionary. They worried that what happened in Germany, home to Europe's elite Jewish community, could also easily happen in America. One group of American Jews who had no compunctions about meeting the anti-Semites head on were Jewish gangsters. Not bound by the conventional rules and constitutional legalities, they took direct and violent action against these Jew haters. Nazi Bund rallies in New York City in the late 1930s created a terrible dilemma for the city's Jewish leaders. With about 20,000 members, the Nazi Bund was the largest anti-Semitic group in the United States. They organized large public rallies. They marched to drum beats wearing brown shirts and swastikas. They carried Nazi flags. Jewish leaders wanted the meeting stopped, but couldn't do so legally. Nathan Perlman, a judge and former Republican congressman, was one Jewish leader who believed that the Jews should demonstrate more militancy. In 1935, he surreptitiously contacted Meyer Lansky, the leading organized crime figure of the time. He contacted him on the 4th of July, and he asked him to help. And Lansky actually related what followed. Perlman assured Lansky that money and legal assistance would be put at his disposal. The only stipulation was that no Nazis would be killed. They could be beaten up, but they couldn't be terminated. Lansky reluctantly agreed. No killing. Always very sensitive about anti-Semitism, Lansky was acutely aware of what the Nazis were doing to Jews. I was a Jew, and I felt for those Jews in Europe who were suffering, he said. They were my brothers. Lansky refused the judge's offer of money and assistance, but he did make one request. He asked Perlman to ensure that after he went into action, he would not be criticized by the Jewish press, and the judge promised to do what he could. Lansky rounded up some of his tough associates and went around New York disrupting Nazi meetings. Young Jews not connected to him or to the rackets also volunteered to help, and Lansky and others taught them how to use their fists and handle themselves in a fight. Lansky's crews worked very professionally. Nazi arms, legs, and ribs were broken, skulls were cracked, but no one died. The attacks continued for more than a year, and Lansky actually earned quite a reputation for doing this work. Lansky himself described to an Israeli journalist one of the onslaughts in Yorkville, the German neighborhood in northeast Manhattan. We got there in the evening, found several hundred people dressed in brown shirts. The stage was decorated with a swastika and pictures of Hitler. The speaker started ranting. There were only 15 of us, but we went into action. We attacked them in the hall and threw some of them out the windows. There were fist fights all over the place. Most of the Nazis panicked and ran out. We chased them and beat them up. Some of them were out of action for months. Yes, it was violence. We wanted to teach them a lesson. We wanted to show them that Jews would not always sit back and accept insults. Reflecting on his role in these episodes, he actually fumed that he helped the Jewish community, but all he got for his trouble was abuse. He believed the city's Jewish leaders were pleased with his actions, but they failed to stop the Jewish press from condemning him. When the newspapers reported on the anti-Bund incidents, they referred to Lansky and his friends as the Jewish gangsters. That infuriated him. They wanted the Nazis taken care of, but they were afraid to do the job themselves. I did it for them, and when it was over, they called me a gangster. No one ever called me a gangster until Rabbi Stephen Wise and the Jewish leaders called me that. We went over there and grabbed everything in sight, all their signs, and smacked the heck out of them. Judd Teller, a reporter for the New York Jewish Daily, relates how he met one day with several men who said they were from Murder Incorporated and wanted a list of Nazis who should be rubbed out. Teller took the request to Jewish communal leaders. They told Teller that if the plan would be put into motion, the police would be informed promptly. Teller relayed this warning to his Murder Incorporated contact, and upon hearing this, the mobster angrily replied, "Tell them to keep their shirts on, okay? We won't ice the bodies, only marinate them." And according to Teller, that was exactly what they did. He said the attacks by the Jewish gangsters were sufficient marination to drastically reduce attendance at Nazi Bund meetings and discouraged Bundists from appearing in uniform singly in the street. After a series of attacks, Bundists protested having their meetings violently broken up, and they asked Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia for protection from the Jewish mobsters. LaGuardia agreed under certain conditions. The Bundists could not wear their uniforms, they could not sing their songs, they could not display their swastikas and Nazi flag, and they could not march beating their drums. The Bundists agreed to his terms, and LaGuardia confined their parades to Yorkville and assigned Jewish and African American police to patrol the route. Thereafter, any Nazi dignitary passing through New York was assured a mixed Jewish and black bodyguard detail. The Nazi Bund was also active across the river in Newark, New Jersey, where there was a large German American community. And as a Jew, Abner Longi Zwilman, who bossed the rackets in that city, was not about to allow Nazis to operate with impunity in his territory. In 1934, he turned to Nat Arno, the Jewish ex-prize fighter, and asked him to organize an anti-Nazi group. Arno recruited through tough New York Jews and ex-boxers, and the group called itself the Minutemen. They borrowed the name from the Minutemen of the Revolutionary War fame. The original Minutemen got their name because they were expected to be ready to fight the British at a minute's notice. Newark's Jewish Minutemen wanted to emulate them in their fight against the Nazis. The Minutemen saw to it that no Nazi Bund meeting would be held in the New Jersey area, particularly in Newark and the small towns surrounding it. Arno and his men monitored the movement of Nazis, and after finding out where their meetings were held, would go and break them up. Arno had financial and political support in these forays from Zwilman. And in those days, Zwilman controlled Newark's police. Whenever the Bund met, the police informed Longi of the time and the place and conveniently abandoned their posts, so the Nazis were left unguarded. With Zwilman's encouragement, one of his prime enforcers, Max Hinkes, joined the group. The Minutemen's most famous exploit occurred in Schwabelhell on Springfield Avenue, bordering the German neighborhood in Irvington. According to Hinkes, Abner Zwilman, during his testimony before Congress in 1951, said, "The Nazi scumbags were meeting one night on the second floor. Nat Arno and I went upstairs and we threw stink bombs into the room where the creeps were. And they came out of the room running from the horrible owner of the stink bombs, running down the steps to escape, to go into the street, to escape. And our boys were waiting there in the street with bats and iron bars. It was like running a gauntlet, for our boys were lined up on both sides of the street. We started hitting, aiming for their heads or any other parts of their body with our bats and iron bars. The Nazis were screaming blue murder. It was one of the most happy moments of my life. It was too bad we didn't kill them all. In other places, we couldn't get inside, so we smashed windows and destroyed their cars, which were parked outside. The Nazis begged police for help and protection. However, the police favored us." So those were some of the exploits of Jewish gangsters within New York and New Jersey. But I just wanted to tell you about one other group that's not often mentioned, but was still a pretty formidable Jewish gang of mobsters, and that was called the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang was Detroit's most notorious organized crime gang in the 1920s and 30s. It was led chiefly by the Bernstein, often misspelled Bernstein, brothers, Raymond, Joseph, Isidore, and Abraham. The Purple Gang was made up of immigrants from Detroit's Lower East Side. The area that was known as Little Jerusalem was bordered by Grediot Avenue, Brush Street, Willis Avenue, and Russell Street. And beginning as disruptive delinquents at Bishop School and progressing to students of Detroit mobsters, Charles Leiter and Henry Shore, who run the Oakland Sugar House, the group was first known as the Sugar House Boys or the Sugar House Gang. The origin of the name Purple Gang, also known as the Purples, has lots of different variations and stories. Among them, street vendors who were victims of the delinquents referred to them as tainted, off color, therefore purple, a purple gang. Other stories say they were named for someone's purple sweater at a meeting to change the name from the Sugar House Boys, taken from the Purple Line Company, a taxi cab company who used gang members to win a trade war. Others still attribute it to the purple dye that was used to ruin clothes during the Cleaners and Dyers War. The gang was originally a loose confederation of independent criminals. They began hijacking alcohol smuggled by others across the Canadian border, chiefly the Detroit River during Prohibition. Al Capone, the notorious Chicago gangster, chose to use the Purple Gang to supply old log cabin whiskey rather than battle them for Detroit territory. Allegedly, several gang members were used as spotters in Chicago's infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In the 1920s, the Purple Gang was known for their instigation of the Cleaners and Dyers War, a dispute between the cleaning industry and its union. The Wholesale Cleaners and Dyers Association was formed by Abe Bernstein and the Detroit Federation of Labor. Membership was coerced by Purple Gang members who often used violence as a means of persuasion. In 1928, 13 members of the Purple Gang were tried for extortion for their role in the war, but each and every one of them were acquitted. Around the time of the trial, the Purple Gang was in its heyday. It controlled all of Detroit's underworld, including the gambling, liquor, and drug trade. The Purple Gang of the late 1920s was nearly invincible against law enforcement. since witnesses were too terrified to testify in murder and criminal trials. Nonetheless, the Purple Gang began to dissolve in the early 1930s through intergang strife and warfare. In September 1931, the Purple Gang murdered 3 of its own members who were double-crossing the gang. The 3 men, Herman Jaime Paul, Isidore Joe Sutker, and Joe Leibowitz, were invited to a peace negotiation at the Collingwood Manor apartment in Detroit. When they arrived, they were shot and killed. Sol Levine, the man who unwittingly transported the 3 men to their deaths, was later caught by Detroit police and pressured into testifying against the gang. And as a result, 3 of the 4 men involved in the murders, including Ray Burstein, were convicted of 3rd-degree murder and sent to jail for life. This event came to the Collingwood Manor Massacre came to be known as the downfall of the Purple Gang. By 1935, the alliance had splintered, and the Purple Gang no longer reigned over Detroit's underworld, with at least 18 members dead and others who had been sent to prison. I just wanted to mention them because they were a pretty formidable force in Detroit. Most people tend to think that most of the Jewish gangsters only operated, for the most part, in New York, New Jersey, East Coast, Las Vegas, but there were really Jewish gangsters that operated in all different parts of the country. So that kind of gives you a bird's eye view of some of the Jewish gangsters that were famous or infamous, what they were famous for, how they did help. I didn't talk at all. They were also at one time responsible for getting guns for the Jews in 1948 and shipping guns to Israel for the War of Independence. That was also something on the positive side of their actions. But if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer any of the questions that you might have. I hope that you've become a little bit enlightened to Jewish gangsterism and Jewish mobsters and some of the things that took place not only in the 1920s and 30s, but also in the late 19th century as well. Questions, comments, remembrances, stories, aspirations.
Perspirations.
Go ahead.
Just talk.
Hello, can you hear
You're
me?
there. You're okay. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
This is Mike Himowitz. I'd sent a note about this to the rabbi, but when I was little, like around 5 years old, the grandfather used to make up all these stories, which he'd take the grandchildren around and tell them. And they had all these people with silly names in them, like Magico the Magnifico and Tiny Tim. And one of his favorites was a character named Greasy Thumb Goosick. Well, not knowing anything about it, I thought it was Greasy was his first name and Thumb Goosick was his last name. When I was out of college, I learned that he was talking about a guy named Greasy Thumb Goosick, Jake Goosick, who was the financial brains behind the Detroit mob and a favorite of Al Capone's. So,
How did you find out about him after college?
I read about it. I was reading something about the mob, and I saw, Jake Goosick's name, and I said, I wonder if that was the guy. And it turned out. And whenever she heard something like that, my grandmother used to yell at him, "Abe, what are you telling the children?"
But didn't you also say that your grandfather told you about Moishe?
Yeah, he is a character called Moishe Pipik, the mikveh inspector. Now that really made got my grandmother mad. Yeah, hey, what are you telling them? And we didn't know what it was. We thought it was the mitzvah inspector. It had something to do with mitzvahs. This is for 5 years old. So my grandfather was a real character. We loved him.
That translates literally to Moses' belly button?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Moshe Pipik.
That's what I'm saying. He had these wonderful names.
Yep. Pipik is Yiddish for belly button.
Oh, yeah, I did know that.
Yes.
So anyway, it was an interesting childhood.
Good story. Great story. Michael?
I just said you find the Pipiks in the mikvahs.
Right.
There you go.
Someone else? Anybody else have any comments, stories? Yes,
Richard Goldstein.
Richard.
Yeah, I wrote you that my grandmother's younger brother was through a marriage related to Bugsy Siegel, who I think was also related somehow to Meyer Lansky. When they grew up together in this area of Brooklyn, this area called Williamsburg, where my father was born. Nobody in my family, though, is a member of any group like that. But through marriage, at that point in the 20s, and I believe that they got divorced because I never got to meet him. I was only 1 year old when he was shot in 1947.
Now, did your parents meet him?
I think he might have come to my father's bar mitzvah.
Really?
Because remember, he was, for my father, it was his uncle's brother-in-law. So it might have been somebody who would come.
Right. Certainly would have been invited. Sure. Interesting. Any other stories? Yes, Michael?
Well, was there interaction between the mafia and the organized Jewish crime syndicate?
There was. Yes, there was
cooperation, wasn't there?
There was cooperation. Yep. Actually, some of what you call organized crime, they took some of the they took some of the systems that Jewish mobsters put into place and began to use them in their own organizations. And some of the from my studying, some of the monetary things that actually made them more money, they took from Jewish mobsters.
Boden.
Boden. Really? I mean, it's a side. It's a side of Judaism that's not. It's not spoken about a lot. The reason I wanted to talk about it was because you don't really hear about it all that much. Every once in a while, you'll hear the name Meyer Lansky, or you'll hear the name of Bugsy Siegel, But I wanted you to know that it was actually a definite organization of people who trafficked in these kinds of activities, and they saw no problem with their sense of Jewishness, because they really didn't really think that much about their religious Jewishness, although they did actually think about the culture of Jews and Judaism and anti-Semitism and Israel and some of the allied ideas that fall outside of the realm of what you might call, quote, religion and the synagogue, and those things they were able to find a way to participate in.
Didn't Meyer Lansky try to emigrate to Israel? And
he did. They wouldn't take him. They refused him. Well, I know he visited Israel a few times, and they allowed him on a tourist visa, but he wanted to become a resident of Israel, and they would not permit him to become a resident of Israel. Yeah, that's true. That is true. Actually, there's a picture in the Jewish Encyclopedia of his visa card with a stamp of rejection from Israel.
Did you say there's currently a problem with Jewish crime in organized crime in Israel?
There is, yes. There is a problem with organized crime in Israel, which actually came from Russia and Russian Jews who came to Israel during the Great Migration of Russian Jews to Israel. There is a pretty sizable organized crime component that exists there today. Yes. Yes, you
Oh,
did
there-
hear me correctly.
No, it's,
That exists in New York City as well.
In Brooklyn, yes, in Coney Island.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Among primarily among Russian Jews.
Right.
They had a pretty strong federation of gangsters in Russia, and they brought them here, and they brought them to Israel, and they continued to operate the same way that they did in Russia. Only
In
in
Russia. And
And
the other
Fran-
thing was that
Fran
I
had-
wanted to
Fran had a
comment.
question too.
Yeah.
Frank's got a question.
Well,
Besides, Rabbi, besides intellectual curiosity, what made you do all that research on this topic?
I simply, I've always been a fan of crime. I read crime novels.
That's
I read crime novels. I read.
Now he tells us.
I really enjoy reading, crime novels, and I came across actually a crime novel from Israel, which is not translated into English, and I read it, and it mentioned a number of these people as sort of heroes of this criminal in the book that I was reading. The book was called in the translation of the book was called the Midnight Hour. But it mentioned all these names in this book, and as I was reading about it, I would jot the names down, and I was really curious about sort of their history and their lineage, and so I decided to do some research on it, and this is what I came up with.
Great.
That's terrific.
Very
Yeah.
good.
Really good.
Yeah, that was how it came to be. I mean, I wish I could say to you the book was translated into English, but it's not. So I don't know if
Project for
anyone
you.
will be able to read it. What?
There's a project for you.
Right. Suzanne had a question.
Well, it wasn't a question.
Oh,
Arnold Annenberg. Annenberg?
Yep.
Yeah. His son is Walter Annenberg.
Oh,
You all know who Walter Annenberg
Yeah.
was?
yes.
Yes.
with
Okay.
Philanthropist,
the
yeah,
buildings that have the Annenberg name, the Annenberg
Yeah.
Center.
yeah.
Well,
That
they
and-
also
Very
owned,
respectable.
Yeah.
yep,
yeah.
they also owned the Philadelphia Inquirer,
Right.
which
Oh,
was
really?
which was for a while a key part
Yeah.
of that racing empire wire, and which then died with it. But then for many years, the Inquirer had a terrible reputation because Annenberg. Everybody knew he was the biggest bookie in the United States, and he owned this newspaper.
Huh.
So
And Walter was US ambassador to the United Kingdom.
yes,
Yes.
Not to mention a very rich man who left a lot of money to the University of Pennsylvania.
And he had the TV guide. Everybody liked that.
He what, the TV guide?
Walter Annenberg was
He
the
created-
founder of the TV guide, the magazine. Yeah.
right,
I didn't know
Publisher.
that. I didn't know that.
yeah.
I didn't know that.
Now,
I thought that
do
was
do
Murdoch.
you know how Jake Guzik got the greasy name, Mike?
I never could find that
Oh.
out.
He
Greasy
had a
thumb?
greasy thumb from all the money he gave the Chicago politicians, mayor, judges, police, and they nicknamed him the Greasy Thumb. And he was a very close friend of Al Capone. He was part of that
Yeah.
syndicate.
Really?
Yeah, and Capone protected him up and down, even after he got beat up by some anti-Semites. You can imagine they disappeared.
I was fascinated by the Purple Gang. I mean,
Right.
they absolutely fascinated because they basically operated with no rules. I mean, they had no rules. Whatever they wanted to do, they did. It didn't matter. There was no sense of morality. There was no sense of nothing. They just operated. And but also, you know, in Detroit, you don't think, at least I didn't think very much about mobsters or Jewish mobsters, you know, having a foothold in Detroit in the Midwest, but they did. They did. Is anyone from Detroit? Anyone have their roots in Detroit? No.
How many of your grandparents were bootleggers?
How many?
Anybody? I'm the only one?
You're the only one who will
The
admit
liquor
it.
store.
My grandmother, they lived in Connecticut, and some cousin lived in Brooklyn, I guess, and he was making bathtub gin. And she would make a weekly trip to Brooklyn. She would take my mother and my aunt and sit them on top of the, she had a roadster, so it had like little seats in the back, didn't have a regular seat. She'd go to the cousin, he'd fill up the car with cases of the bootleg gin. Then she'd cover it with quilts and make it look like a little chair. And she'd sit my mother and my aunt on top, and she would stop at every policeman that she saw on the way back to Connecticut to make sure she was going in the right way. She never got caught. She was the New England distributor, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I think during the 1930s that my grandfather, my father's father, had a speakeasy for a while.
Really?
She was in that business as well.
See?
Interesting.
Thank
Anyone
you,
else?
Richard. I'm glad I wasn't the only one.
Anyone
Well,
else?
if you have roots in Brooklyn, you know, from the 1800s to early 1900s, there were a lot of people.
Oh yeah, sure.
When
And your aunt was the Connecticut connection.
My grandmother.
Your grandmother was the Connecticut connection.
Yeah.
well, you know,
Well, that was during
Prohibition,
Prohibition. So it was,
Sure.
yeah.
during Prohibition, there was an allowance for the making of sacramental wine.
Yeah, I don't think
Yes.
that
So
gin
rabbis
fulfilled that.
a lot of rabbis would dispense a lot of sacramental wine just before Shabbos.
Yeah, there was dispensation for sacramental wine. That's true. That is true. But I don't think that's what they were bootlegging.
No, it was local neighborhood.
Yeah.
Rabbi, you know, there was a very close connection between the Luciano, Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, the organ, putting it all together. So that was a very big influence from, I guess, the early Jewish mobs when they joined with Luciano as young thugs, criminals.
Yeah. The other thing that I found fascinating in my research for this was they were as young as they were. And their lifespans were so short.
Right.
Yeah, what a surprise.
I mean, most of them lived maybe 40, maybe.
Yeah, I noticed that when you were given their birth.
Yeah. That they
It's
did not
tough to
live.
outrun a 45.
What?
It's tough to outrun a 45 caliber bullet.
Really. But I think, you know, I think there's something to be said for the fact that you know they wanted these guys were daring, and they wanted excitement, and they wanted challenge, and they, you know, it was you know, nothing frightened them. You know, I mean, I think you have to have a certain personality to operate that way, where nothing frightens you, or where you don't give something a second thought. I mean, most people think things through and look at the positives, look at the pros, look at the cons. I mean, these guys They just walked forward. They didn't look at the pros and the cons.
Poor impulse control.
Yeah, and it was exciting for them. It was, definitely exciting. But I also thought it was interesting that every one of them pretty much kept their families out of their business. That their families were completely separate.
The Italians.
It's not like they had sons that followed them into the business, or they brought their sons, where that happens with other like the Italian crime families and the Sicilian crime families, and where their whole families and generations of people. That didn't take place like that in the Jewish community or with Jewish gangsters. It was just them. That was just them with their buddies. Any other
Thank
questions?
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
That was
Sure.
very interesting.
Really.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
One other
Pleasure.
note. Happy birthday, Gusty.
Oh, thank you.
Happy birthday, Gusty.
Today's her birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy
Happy
birthday,
birthday.
Gusty.
Happy birthday.
Thank